Hello and welcome to our session on the wonderful web of ties. It's a session dedicated to Year 9 and the Year 9 poetry scheme. It's focusing on how do we encourage our students to develop those connections between poems more seamlessly. And I think if you've listened to the Amuse Bouche for Year 7 and Year 8 and equally the Making Comparison session for Year 8, this one's almost an extension from there, where students need to be able to move backwards and forwards across their poems and be able to establish those links. And there's more of an emphasis upon how symbolism could be the route to be able to do so as well. So hopefully it's useful. We'll go through some key points of comparison between poems. We're going to look at the cluster of human power and think about how we can develop those connections through the semantic fields, through the writer's intent, and also through symbolism. So these 4 poems all link the concept of human power, and I think the best starting place is to get straight into looking at the words. I think our students will quickly use words they've heard that sound good, or words that are really new to them that they want to use over and over again. And sometimes I think they run the risk of applying the same word to multiple poems and haven't really understood the meaning of the word. So a really good example is the word oppression, and I think you could use oppression for all 4 of these poems, but we could probably say something far more precise by really thinking about that poem and the behaviour of the speaker. So if we started off with Ozymandias, a really good word to use there would be to talk about tyranny and the abuse of power and how that dictator abuses their authority. Whereas in London, we're talking about the abuse of power by institution or institutions, but it's more about the exploitation and the manipulation of the poor by the ruling elite. Now, both of these poems would link to oppression, but there are slight differences, and actually we could be far more precise. And I think this activity of really kind of thinking about how the word could be applied to that poem and asking the students to defend why they've applied that word by using it in the text is a good way of just enabling greater precision within their selection of vocabulary choices. The next activity, once they've built a semantic field, is to go back and recall their 3 key quotations. And it's not just about recall that activity. I think it's about making sure that students consider how their vocabulary, that semantic field they've built around London, for example, can be linked to that quotation. So if they had the word manipulation or exploitation, they could link it to Mind Forged Manacles. And again, that would be their point evidence. And they're beginning to verbally think about how these words connect to key quotations. And then you're beginning to establish a comparison with other poems. The next thing is to think about how we could use or apply our external metaphors. This could be something that you could leave out with Year 9, or you could choose to include it. It's used quite widely within Key Stage 4. But again, it's another way of just sharpening that opening point. So is it that the people in London feel bombarded by the abuse of power of the ruling elite? That could be one way around from that as well. So those 3 activities don't all have to be used in conjunction. They might just be a quick task that you could use with Year 9 when you are looking at a cluster of poems that you could perhaps incorporate just to help develop that precision of vocabulary. So the images on this slide are directly taken from the recipe book that we use at Key Stage 4, and they're not to be incorporated with the Year 9 scheme. That's why they're not mentioned in any of the lessons. But you are discussing symbolism with the students, and a point of comparison or connection between poems could be just simply looking at how a symbol is used differently across poems. So if you're unsure or you would like greater detail when you're delivering, I would always go back to the recipe book. There's some fantastic symbols being referred to across the different poems. In this particular example, it mentions blood. We're told what it represents. It gives you the links to the poems, but it also gives you the quotation bank. And I think if you're someone that's new to teaching this scheme with Year 9, that would be my first place that I would go to. Not so much in delivery to students, but just to help support my own subject knowledge about how I'm going to establish connections. Because students are talking about symbolism, you'll notice that they'll be quite familiar with remains, and they would have seen that blood symbol pop up in London as well. So it's a great opportunity to ask the students, well, both of these poets are using this symbolism within their writing, but how is it being used in a similar or different way to one another? Can you perhaps provide context to why it would be presented differently? It's just a fantastic discussion point, I think, to have with students. And I would really encourage, because there are so many seamless links between poems, I'd really encourage the use of symbolism and thinking about comparisons through symbolism, especially with Year 9. If anything, to develop their recall of the key symbols of the poems, but equally to generate that debate around the writer's intent. So this slide isn't included within the Year 9 scheme, but I thought it could be a useful way into thinking about comparisons between texts. So I've picked the same 4 cluster, but it could be something you do with just 2 poems that you're looking at in terms of a comparison. And it's a really quick 4 times better. So imagine that you've looked at the word choices, you developed your semantic fields of each of the poems. Now we're going to have a look at the key symbols of each poem. So for checking out my history, we've got the bandage, we have the manacles in London, the statue in Ozymandias, and the curtain in My Last Duchess. And students, preferably with an interval timer, are given 2 minutes to list the key meanings of the symbols below, and then they'll pass around their table and ask them to add further meanings onto it. And what should happen is that students get a really detailed explosion of that symbol from all their peers on the table, and they're able to therefore link it back to their key semantic fields that are developed for that. So it could be that they've looked at My Last Duchess, they've talked about the abuse of power, they've looked at perhaps the idea of control within their semantic field, and then they need to apply that symbol to the concept of control. So it could be that he's the one that seems to have control over the curtain, but in fact it's the Duchess that has control over him, in the very fact that he has to hide himself away from it, or hide her away from him. I think for Year 9, at this stage of their learning, that students will feel quite confident in being able to analyse AO2. They'll be able to pick out the quotations quite readily. They'll be able to zoom in onto keywords and explore the different layers of meaning from them. I think what students find really difficult to do, because it is a harder skill, is to establish a meaningful comparison between poems. And it might be something that you've got to explicitly model a few times with students. So attached again on this slide, again it's not used within the Year 9 scheme, but as a point of reference for you as teachers to go back to that recipe book, these kind of comparison little boxes or grids, they're found within the recipe book, and they're brilliant because they identify the 2 quotations that you can connect to, but equally they explain the reasons why they connect to them. And so I've used this with my Year 11 class previously, and what's been really useful about it is it gives me a frame of reference, and I include the vocabulary at the bottom to help support that. So in this example, I'll talk about how in Ozymandias we're talking about the Snerical command, that he believes that he can assert his power beyond the grave, and this links this idea of control. So again, going back to that concept of vocabulary I've built up previously in the lesson, he believes that he can control beyond the grave, whereas in I gave commands that all smiles stop together, we could talk about how in My Last Duchess the Duke feels as though he can naively attempt to control something that's as instinctive as a smile. And that could be the comparison. Or equally, you could talk about smiles. So the idea that we have the difference between the sneer versus the smile, and that both of these are instinctive. However, in Ozymandias it means something quite different to in My Last Duchess, where the smile's there to torment, and here in Ozymandias the sneer's there to torment others. So you can see that there are a range of different comparisons that you could make, either through the lens of AO2 or through the lens of AO1 and being far more conceptual. But I think any given opportunity that you have in a lesson, just to pause before they do the independent application and really model that process of thinking about how the 2 poems compare through the lens of this concept. And here is the culmination of all their hard work. So you could either introduce this towards the end of the lesson, or perhaps do this just before they write their comparison. But it's just a way of deconstructing an example answer. And this one's taken from a recipe book, but you can develop your own for Year 9. That's probably a bit more applicable to their ability. The best thing I think to demonstrate within this example is how they're focusing in upon symbolism. So in the first sort of discussion of, I believe it's Remains, that's the name poem in this example, they talk about the shadow and they look at the symbols in the shadow, and then very cleverly in the link they discuss the symbolism of light and use that as a point of comparison. And I just thought that built on beautifully from what we discussed previously about looking at the comparison through the lens of AO1 or AO2. And then you've got the rag of skills over there that you could use and a reminder of the key vocabulary that you've looked at. Just as a couple of points of reflection, I think as much as possible encourage the students to automatically make those links, get their vocabulary right, make sure students understand the differences between these poems. So although they all talk about human power, there are slight differences in the way that they present that concept of human power and different discussions that they're having about it as well. Equally, encourages students to think about symbolism as a point of connection between poems, if applicable, and if not, rely quite heavily on that AO1 focus of looking at the comparison through the lens of a concept. Hopefully that's been of use to you. Please just speak to your link director if there's anything you want to go over or have any questions about, and they'll be happy to help.